Nicaragua has been a target of the U.S. empire not just for decades, but for centuries. In the 1850s, the U.S. mercenary William Walker invaded Nicaragua and declared himself so-called president. This is a white U.S. American who didn't speak Spanish, had nothing to do with Nicaragua. He invaded the country. He reinstated slavery, and he declared himself fake president, declared himself dictator. And he hired a bunch of mercenaries to try to wage war. Ever since then, the U.S. has been trying to the U.S. invaded Nicaragua 3 times and military occupied it on 3 different occasions. The U.S. then created the National Guard of Anastasio Somoza, the brutal, murderous dictator, and trained him. And then when the U.S. was forced to leave after the successful guerrilla army campaign led by Augusto Sandino, then the U.S. created the National Guard as its puppet and helped support Somoza as he carried out a coup to take over Nicaragua. And then, of course, there's the Contra War, this blockade. So the U.S. has been suffocating and attacking and torturing Nicaragua and even military occupying it on and off for over 150 years. But this brings me to the latest. In 2018, as I've talked about a lot on this show and at the Grayzone, the U.S. supported a bloody, violent, horrific right-wing coup attempt against Nicaragua's leftist Sandinista government in what began in April 2018 and went from April until July of 2018. I have interviewed victims who were tortured and attacked. I've interviewed family members and loved ones of people who were killed, brutally killed, with their bodies set on fire by U.S.-backed coup mongers in this brutal coup attempt. It ultimately failed to overthrow the elected leftist socialist Sandinista government. And then the Trump administration, under that neoconservative war criminal, John Bolton, when he was national security advisor, he, in his capacity as one of the top foreign policy officials in the Trump administration, declared Nicaragua to be part of the so-called troika of tyranny alongside Cuba and Venezuela. Well, this leads me to the latest developments, because the U.S. failed in 2018 to overthrow the Nicaraguan government, but it certainly did not leave the Sandinista government alone. And here, the latest in the coup plotting is we see that neoconservative coup plotter Victoria Nuland, one of the main architects of the coup in Ukraine in 2014, in which she was physically present at the square, the plaza for Euromaidan. She was handing out cookies. There's photos of her handing out cookies in this coup in 2014, by the way, in which Nazis, literal neo-Nazis and Ukrainian fascists played a key role as the muscle behind the coup, carrying out a massacre burning down a union hall, and with also using snipers, and then blaming the snipers as part of a false flag operation to carry out the coup. Victoria Nuland, this hardcore neoconservative, married to one of the most notorious neoconservative operatives in Washington. So, I mean, her entire family are a bunch of warmongering lunatics. She recently has been meeting with Costa Rica. Now, this is important because Costa Rica is the main ally of the U.S. in destabilizing Nicaragua. Costa Rica has a neoliberal pro-imperialist government, which is a puppet government of the U.S. And what do they talk about in her meeting with the vice foreign minister of Costa Rica? They talked about strengthening democracy in the region. We all know what that's code word for. When the U.S. says strengthening democracy, it means overthrowing independent governments that challenge its interest and installing a compliant puppet regime. That's exactly what the U.S. wants to do in Nicaragua, and that's exactly what it's doing in Costa Rica with neoconservative coup plotter Victoria Nuland meeting with top Costa Rican officials. This is not the only example of the U.S. government working together, conspiring, plotting with Costa Rica to overthrow Nicaragua's Sandinista government. This brings me to an article I just published at the Grayzone. U.S. Congress outlines new phase of economic attacks and hybrid war on Nicaragua's Sandinista government. I talk about how the U.S. Congress invited neoconservative regime change strategists to discuss the next wave of hybrid warfare on Nicaragua's elected Sandinista government. And those tactics will likely include imposing an economic blockade through more sanctions, refusing to recognize the legitimacy of the elected President Daniel Ortega, and borrowing tactics that Trump used in his coup attempt in Venezuela, which is very ironic because Biden claims to be so different from Trump in every way, but they're actually continuing a lot of Trump's coup plotting policies in Latin America. I talk about this hearing, this committee, House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing on September 21st, and it explicitly showed the U.S. plans for destabilizing the elected Sandinista government of Nicaragua. That will, one of the main steps will involve passing this new legislation called Renacer, the Rebirth Act. Renacer, that's what it means in Spanish. And this is being sponsored by neoconservative Republicans and Democrats alike. It is a thoroughly bipartisan. The NICA Act was passed by the U.S. Congress with no opposition. So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, none of them in the squad opposed the U.S. sanctions on Nicaragua because it's bipartisan economic warfare on actually existing socialism. Actually existing democratic socialism, I should point out. And they talked about some of the tactics they're going to use. One of their tactics is they're probably going to refuse to recognize Guaido and potentially recognize someone as a kind of one Guaido figure as fake interim president of Nicaragua, as they have been doing of Venezuela. They hinted at that in this in this committee hearing. But the most hilarious moment in the committee hearing was the top U.S. State Department official who was represented at the hearing, which is Emily Mandrala. And she spoke. And this, for me, is really an eye-opening, hilarious moment because this is one of the key U.S. State Department officials overseeing Latin American policy. And she knows so little about this country, Nicaragua, that she's trying to destabilize and overthrow the elected government of. She knows so little about this country that she referred to Nicaragua as an island. Let me play this clip. Because it's so hilarious. This is the U.S. State Department Deputy Assistant Secretary Emily Mandrala at the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing on September 21st, in which they discussed ways to plot a coup and regime change in Nicaragua. Here are her comments.
I will note that Nicaragua is the second poorest country in the hemisphere. Their economy contracted 3.9% in 2019 and 3% in 2020. War. We are very concerned about the humanitarian situation on the island in the wake of the hurricanes, as you mentioned.
The humanitarian situation on the island.
Deputy Assistant Secretary.
Nicaraguan island a minute ago. I think you were referring to the poorest country.
You can see here, this is a U.S. congressman who is correcting her. This is so obvious. Even Andy Levin, who is like a neoliberal Democrat, there's nothing special about him. He's not a smart guy. He's not anti-war. Even he had to correct her because it was so absurd that a U.S. State Department official plotting regime change in Nicaragua referred to it as an island.
You called Nicaraguan island a minute ago. I think you were referring to the poorest country in the hemisphere, Haiti.
The humanitarian situation on the island.
This is her bio at the U.S. State Department. Emily Mandrala, who thinks that Nicaragua is an island, is Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Western Hemispheric Affairs, covering Cuba and regional migration. She was Executive Director of the Center for Democracy in the Americas from 2017 to 2021. Before that, she was Director of Legislative Affairs in the National Security Council and working at this Department of State as a special advisor to the coordinator for Cuban affairs, and before that, an advisor on Central American regional affairs. This is one of the top U.S. diplomats in Central America and Latin America as a whole, who thinks that Nicaragua is an island. I mean, what the caliber, incredible caliber of U.S. diplomats. That's why I always say they're so-called diplomats. The U.S. doesn't have real diplomats. The U.S. has imperial apparatchiks, coup plotters, spooks. Anyway, continuing my report here. Another example of the brilliance of U.S. Congress people is the California Congressman Juan Vargas hilariously claimed that Fidel Castro is still alive and in power in Cuba, and claimed, quote, he's been there a long time. And he was talking about how hard it is to get rid of Fidel Castro. So they talked about their other plans to plot regime change. They want to expel Nicaragua from the Organization of American States, which, good riddance. I mean, the OAS is horrible, so that would be cool if they did. And Nicaragua was planning to leave pretty soon anyway, and Latin America is trying to replace the OAS anyway. They also fear-mongered about Nicaragua's relationship with Russia and referred to Latin America, like always, as the U.S. doorstep, which shows their very colonial mentality. So who are the people who participated? Albio Cires, who is a right-wing Democrat, a Cuban-American from New Jersey, who represents the kind of extreme anti-Cuba lobby. He was one of the main sponsors of the NICA Act as well, with the Miami lobby elements. And he was also joined by other neoconservative figures in the U.S. Congress, including Mark Green, a neoconservative Republican who hilariously couldn't pronounce the names of the right-wing Nicaraguan regime change activists and coup plotters the U.S. supports, but he wanted us to feel really bad about them, even though he couldn't pronounce their name. He also fear-mongered about Russia. And then you have one of the worst neocons in Congress, that is Maria Elvira Salazar. So Maria Elvira Salazar she was the replacement for Ileana Ros-Lehtinen in Miami. She is a hardcore far-right Cuban-American representing the far-right anti-Cuba lobby in Miami. And she went crazy in this hearing. And she complained, the United States is not present in this hemisphere, period. Complaining that the U.S. needs to intervene more with more coups, more military intervention, more meddling across Latin America. So these are the hardcore neoconservatives. Also, Joaquin Castro participated, a Democrat. This is very much bipartisan. And then, of course, Juan Vargas, who complained, quote, we do a whole lot of things to try to get rid of them. He's talking about leftist leaders. And we're not very successful. We did a whole lot of damn things against all these guys, and they still seem to survive. And then he said, Fidel Castro has, quote, been there a long time. I mean, we wanted to get rid of him for a long time. We've done a lot of things to try to get rid of him, but we can't get rid of him. Well, the U.S. didn't get rid of him, but he actually died 5 years ago, genius. So it says to me, I mean, you hear these Congress people in the U.S. constantly refer to the Cuban government as the Castro regime, even though Castro has been dead for 5 years and his brother Raul is not president. They've had a new president for years now, Diaz-Canel, who has no relation whatsoever to the Castros. So it's absolutely ridiculous. The State Department talked about more of its, if you want, you can read the article. They talked about more of their scheming. And specifically, I mentioned the role of Costa Rica. Also present at the hearing was the former president of Costa Rica, Laura Chinchilla, who was playing a key role working with the Biden administration to try to bring about regime change in Nicaragua. They also had a bunch of other neoconservative figures from hawkish think tanks like CSIS, which is funded by Western governments and the arms industry. And they had these neoconservative figures from Nicaragua itself, these right-wing coup plotters, including the wife of the U.S.-funded, U.S.-trained Nicaraguan coup leader, Felix Maradiaga. Her name is Berta Valle, who, like her husband, was trained at the elite billionaire, corporate-funded neoliberal playground, the World Economic Forum, which runs the Davos meetings, which is just like a dystopia, like a hellish dystopia of all of the corporate elites from around the world. And Felix Maradiaga, this Nicaraguan coup leader, funded and trained by the U.S., was also cultivated over a decade by the World Economic Forum, along with his wife, who participated in this congressional hearing to talk about the next stage in U.S. hybrid warfare to try to bring about regime change against the democratically elected Sandinista socialist government of Nicaragua. The U.S. meddling and coup plots never end. It really is torture.